We Move, session 8 with Thea Cochrane. My name is Jenny and I work for Music Hackspace as the Community and Events Coordinator, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this session today. Just before Thea gets rolling, in case you didn't know, We Move is a series of seminars, 25 altogether, that will be hosted live in London, but also live streaming simultaneously. And each of these seminars is led by music and tech experts who just happen to be women and gender minority. So today we have Thea Cochrane, who I'm going to talk about you now for a minute. Okay, so Thea is a composer, music producer, audio editor, in addition to being a preservation engineer for the British Library's Sound Heritage Project. Thea started out training at Peter Gabriel's Real Words Studios and has gone on to a fascinating and varied career in sound design. Notably working for the Doctor Who radio franchise as a sound designer and composer for their many episodes across Torchwood, Bernice, Summerfield and Companion Chronicles series. And we're so excited to have her talk about sound design today. So welcome, Thea.
Welcome. Thank you. So, let me make sure I'm running this properly. So briefly, this is how I got started working with audio drama. I'd grown up interested in sound and music and messing with cassette machines and so on, and later a synth as well. I learned keyboard and some guitar and played in bands at school, and shared a cassette 4-track porta studio with my dad. And then later I went on to do a music and sound technology degree at what is now Leeds Beckett University. As part of that course, I had the option of a placement year, so I wrote to all the studios and artists that I was interested in to ask if they'd let me basically come and work for them for a year. And after one of the oddest interviews I've ever had, I ended up spending a year working as an assistant engineer in Peter Gabriel's studio. That's where I started learning Pro Tools and Logic, and before that I'd been mainly using Cubasis and Cubase SX. After university, I was looking for what to do next, and a friend of a friend who wanted me to engineer their album so that they could deal with just the artistic side and let me deal with the technical side. Another friend asked if I could create some backing tracks and music for a theatre show she was working on, for some children, like a children's group, a part of the local amateur dramatics. And that led to the adult group asking if I could please do some sound effects for them as well. And one of the adults at that group had been involved with a company called Big Finish Productions, and he said that they were always on the lookout for new sound designers to come on board. It turns out that knowing the person who'd made the recommendation and knowing how to use Pro Tools was enough to get me an audition with Big Finish. And after about a year since I finished university, I was doing my first paid freelance project for them. But I'd only done music up until that point, so I was starting out with an hour-long piece of science fiction audio drama. It was a little bit daunting. I did freelance for a number of years before I decided to add on a teaching qualification, and I did some teaching at a local college. I ended up managing a couple of courses and teaching on several more. And then in 2018, I ended up moving to the project at the British Library to digitise, improve catalogue entries, and enable access to a large slice of the National Sound Archive, which is what I'm working on just now. And that's probably a whole other talk by itself that other people can give later. So very quickly, this is what a project from Big Finish would probably start off looking like. So the actors get their scripts in advance, and on the day they have a separate booth each. They can see the other actors in the other booths, but they're acoustically isolated. And that gives you the freedom when you're editing to use different parts of different takes, or use radically different processing on one voice if they are playing an alien or a robot or something like that. They'll rehearse each scene and record it, and they sometimes record their rehearsals as well. And then they might do extra takes of the whole scene or individual parts if the director feels that they need pickups, or for anything for the sake of coverage, really. So at the end of the recording day, they'll also do all the crowd scenes, where you might need something specific for reactions from a crowd, for instance. Also, it means that the actors get carried away with their screaming. They haven't messed up their voice for the entire day. So just to say, this is a large Pro Tools document. I would get that with a marked up script with an indication of what lines the director liked best, what takes the director liked best. And a sort of time reference for where to find each scene in that document, just to give you an indication of how long this can be. That document is 420 minutes long, so it's about 6 hours, 7 hours. I think it was recorded across 2 days. The files tend to be named based on the character that the actor's playing rather than the name of the actor, which makes it much easier to find if you've got one actor who's playing multiple roles. So my first job is to edit the dialogue down into sort of preferred takes for each scene, sticking as closely to the script as possible. I then add Foley sounds such as movement, footsteps, explosions, guillotines, futuristic coffee machines, whatever is required by the script, and then general atmosphere that goes on in the background. Then I do any effects processing, especially reverbs for each location. And to make specific sound, I might be making new recordings. I can use recordings from various sound libraries that we've got access to. And there's also, I can create or process sound through a synthesizer and then layer all of those to create something new and specific for that particular play. There was a lot I didn't know going in about the most effective workflows. And actually, I'll just show you a couple of, I've got an example to show you. So that's what the finished project would look like. That's a 1 hour audio play. The top tracks are the sound design with the dialogue in. The pink track below it is music, and there's a little blue edit track in between for me to edit things on if I wanted to like mess with the length of things or drop in an extra little section that we've changed. The next 2 tracks there, the yellow one and the little blue one underneath, are the theme tune and the sort of mastering chain that everything goes through, and then the bottom track there is where everything gets printed as the final version that will go for duplication. So, yeah, there's a lot I didn't know going in. I'm just going to try and make this run properly again. When you're working with hundreds of tracks on a piece that's over an hour long, it's hard to know when it's finished sometimes. And the most effective way to not... Sorry, I've messed up. I didn't know about the most effective workflows for working on this kind of project. I thought going in that I could have 1 track per sound effect and just let it build up, but it turns out you hit a limit of tracks very, very quickly that way. What I was told later on is that the best way is to have general purpose sound effects tracks, and everything goes on there, and you adjust the levels and you adjust the reverbs, and you would do all your processing somewhere else and then bring it in processed, as it were. And then you can fine tune the automation for each sound. And I thought I had a clip that would demonstrate that, but anyway. So, for instance, you might have a voice that needs to go through, like it's sounding through a PA system. So you could process that and drop that into place rather than having the processing happening live on every single track. That way you can get back to it if you need to change it, but it's also not taking up loads and loads of room in the session. Then there's buses, and you might be familiar with buses for routing different parts of a mix together before it reaches the final mix fader. It makes life a lot easier if you want to turn up all the drums or all the guitars at once, or if you want to put an effect on everything in a particular area. I found it helped to speed things up to have dialogue on one bus, FX on another, Atmos and ambiences, and reverbs. And it means that when things get busy with explosions or large mechanical drills, you can use sidechain compression to lower the effects so that the dialogue is still audible. The dialogue is the most important thing because it carries the story, in the same way that in music lead vocals are the most important thing and have to be treated with a lot of respect as you're going through. I found that out after getting it wrong for a while. So at the first few projects I worked on, I would have a separate Pro Tools document for every single scene, and it meant that unpicking things to fix things or change a reverb and then having to find all the other scenes that used the same reverb was a big job. And then I'd have to bounce it out and then reassemble that completed project. Luckily I was able to talk to people who had been doing it longer than I have to get a better idea of how to set things up. The other thing to keep in mind is that this was the mid to late 2000s, so processors weren't quite as fast as they are now, hard drives weren't quite as big, and Pro Tools didn't have offline bouncing. So when the project was finished, the time taken to bounce the final version out had to be the real-time playback for the entire thing. And when I first got hold of Isotope RX in 2007, I would literally go and watch a film or something whilst it batch denoised all the recordings I'd made during a day. As I mentioned, I haven't done much work on this sort of thing lately because I've been working on a 5-year project at the British Library. My most recent project with Big Finish Productions was last year, done in some spare time whilst we were in lockdown, but that hasn't been released yet, so I'm not able to talk about that too much. I did keep on working on music projects as well, when time allowed. I'm working on a couple of music projects with a singer-songwriter at the moment. When I was thinking about what to talk about tonight, I'd been thinking about how going from audio drama to music and back again can bring an unusual perspective to things. where you might reasonably audition several door slams, looking for the one that conveys the right emotion or the one that sounds the most angry, and then you find yourself looking at a folder full of drum samples a bit more differently because you're thinking, what emotion does this snare drum bring? The rest of this is going to be about some of the things I've learned from doing sound design work that can be applied to music, or vice versa. I've definitely found it enriching to go from one to the other, and even having a couple of projects running at the same time, you can take things that you've done in one thing and move them to the other. So, first suggestion is recording with the effects on. I'm sure this idea might be making some of you nervous, but hear me out. I'm not saying that you must only record with the effects on and deliberately limit your options, though that might not be a bad thing. But one of the things when working with actors, if their voice is going to be heavily processed, like if they're playing an alien or a monster, is if they can hear the effect in their headphones, because the effect of hearing it means that they alter their performance. They might over-enunciate if they're being vocoded or ring modulated or pitch shifted to make things more intelligible. Otherwise, some syllables can get lost and it makes the speech difficult to understand. It might be tricky to imagine what that would sound like if you haven't done it much, so it's excellent for the performer to hear that in real time, even if you change the effect later on. It might be that the voice treatment is changed during production, and if you're working in Pro Tools, you'll have an unprocessed copy because what it records is dry and the effects stay on the track, unless you're doing something clever with the auxiliary buses. The main lesson here is when it comes to the effects, they can change your performance, so it's best to be hearing them as you record. And if you know exactly what the effects change is going to be, for instance with the voices of the Daleks or the Cybermen, it should be fine to record with the effect on and don't even bother keeping a dry version. If you know the sound of a guitar and you know that that guitar needs to be a particular way, you could record it as it is and not worry about having multiple amplifier options available at mix. You might not even bother with a DI copy, and it makes your mix engineer like you a bit more when you're only giving them one option rather than 12. Reverb, even things like auto-tune or unusual filtering might give the singer something different to lean into when you're recording. Or you might choose to record in a fancy particular space. I believe parts of Bat for Lashes' first album had vocals that were recorded out in the woods by the studio. And I've heard of people recording with the singer lying down on their back or standing up on top of something. The effect of changing the parameters where you're recording will change what the performance sounds like, and it's worth experimenting with. Also, that old trick of messing with vary speed, which is a lot easier to do now in DAWs than it used to be, where you can speed up the whole track, record something and then slow it down again, or slow it down a bit, record something and then speed it up again, to get different timbres on the voices. Another suggestion is to embrace getting it wrong. So sometimes you'll be doing things wrongly or differently which make you sound different from other people. If you assume that most people are using a DAW, and most DAWs come with a suite of loops and instruments and effects, then it's kind of like being in a cooking competition where everyone has the same equipment and the same ingredients. It's great that we've got access to good tools, and there doesn't need to be a hugely obvious difference between projects made at home and projects made in a commercial recording studio. But trying to do this in a non-standard way can get you some interesting results, or mistakes, depending how you're looking at it. When I was first starting out with sound design, I was doing lots of things to hide the fact that I didn't have access to all the industry standard tools. And it made everything I sound more individual because I didn't have the tools. From my point of view, I was reaching for something and not quite making it, but they were often better than having something more generic that everyone else already had, and you probably already heard. I used to teach someone, and granted they were quite young, who was trying very hard to sound like a famous producer-composer, to the point where they were systematically removing everything that made their music individual to them. There are now several plugins that will make, for instance, sound like it's been on a cassette that's been left out in the sun on a magnet. I didn't have access to those, so to try and get a similar effect, I copied a whole scene onto a cassette and then bounced it back and forth between two cassettes, and then copied it back onto Pro Tools, and it still sounded too hi-fi, so I ended up playing it through a stereo and making it up with a really bad microphone as well. And that kind of thing can give you just something a little bit different that you wouldn't get from a basic, this will make your track sound like it's been played in a VHS machine plugin. One of my favourite things for making bleepy sounds for gadgets and things in sci-fi is a little Korg synth that runs on the Nintendo DS. because you can mic that up, and you not only get the bleep, but you get the little button push noise as you're pressing it, and you get the little speaker effect, and you can get all that in one go without having to do any processing at all. Sometimes you'll try and do something and it won't be right for what you're doing, but it might be really cool sounding, and you can keep it for another time when that will be the thing that you reach for. I used to use a little Korg K oscillator, which is sort of the instrument rather than the effect, and I found there's a couple of plugins that did some really weird things to it, and it wasn't at all what I wanted for the music project I was doing, but I later used it as like a abstract sound effect. My third suggestion, hang on, this is an example. I need to stop this. So this is what I didn't want to risk running Pro Tools in front of an audience because I've seen that go very badly a few times. So this is what the Pro Tools session looks like. So I've got some tracks of dialogue at the top. You can see underneath I've got the one that's labelled computer wet and comms wet are processed files, and the dry files are underneath, but they're turned off. This was me trying to get a sort of glitchy sound on a voice, and I used a thing, if I can quit out of this for a second, called Black Triangle, which looks like the Black Rectangle, sorry, which looks like this. I hope you can see how I made that mistake. What you do is you load a sound into it, and it plays them all randomly at different rates and different pitches. It's free. It's on the Reactor user library. I've got a little collection of the kinds of sounds it makes here. So this is me running voices through it. I'll just play a little bit because it's quite disheartening after a while. I've got about 6 minutes of this. There we go. That up with like a little voice clips and voice samples, and let it run for a while, and then I've taken the bits that I liked and joined them together to make the finished scene. And I should have the finished scene here somewhere. So you'll hear two actors talking, and the computer's kind of glitching in the background, and then yeah, it's down here. We were using a QuickTime player because dropping everything to Logic was causing some problems.
It was nobody's fault. Just random, like today. Oh, what's that?
Oh, that's my computer. It's been doing that for a couple of days. It's totally knackered, I think. That's why I haven't been able to run analysis on that water sample.
Your greetings.
Although it's the first time it's done that, excuse me.
Greetings.
Hello?
Greetings from the government of Maximidirus. We wish to open a peaceful dialogue with you.
The government? I thought this place was ruled by a planetary council.
Professor Summerfield, is Rick with you?
Yes?
Get down here, both of you.
Look, Kerry, we're very busy right now.
Tate's body's gone missing.
I could give you additional context for that, but just the point is that I was able to drop those things in, having generated them automatically, and it also lets you hear what some of the stuff sounds like from what I was talking about earlier. Back into this. This is all neat and tidy. My next suggestion is about thinking about spaces and real spaces versus unreal spaces. Just put my auto scroll back on. Hang on, is that? Is this gone into a strange order? Yeah, it has. I'm going to ignore that slide for a moment. One of them is the next idea I had was to record everything, and the reason I haven't got a slide for this is it's not directly connected to Big Finish exactly. It's more connected to it was something Peter Gabriel did actually, and linked to the idea of messing about and getting it wrong and letting yourself get things wrong is to record stuff. And when I was Peter's assistant engineer, one of my jobs was to log all the recordings that we were making as we were going. So we'd be running a DAT pretty much any time he was working on something. And if there was anything interesting or cool that happened, we could make a note of when that happened and grab it back. And it might have been a musical idea, or it might have been some equipment doing something that it wasn't meant to do. A couple of times I remember coming in the mornings and finding a bit of equipment had started crapping out to some extent, and we were able to record that for a while before we actually fixed it. When I'm working at home, I'm not quite that thorough, but I might have I've got an old Zoom recorder that I leave hanging off the back of my sound card, and it just records whatever I'm doing If there's anything fun that happens, I'll make a note and keep that bit. I won't keep the whole thing. If nothing happens at all that I found interesting, I'll just ditch the whole recording. So I'm not keeping everything and having gigabytes and gigabytes of stuff. Sometimes, especially if you're messing with like plugins on plugins and plugins, you can't put the DAW into record and capture it without stopping it. So, and especially sometimes when you change a setting in a delay and it carries on for ages, you want to grab that. So having the ability to capture that is really useful. Another thing I really like in Pro Tools is using the scrub function to move back and forth over a file. It's kind of like record scratching a little bit. Or messing with a reel of tape when you can like spin it over the heads and find an erase point, but you can get some really interesting effects that way. It's especially good for sort of glitching communications and things. You also, I mean, we've got a long history in music of broken guitar amplifiers that sound really cool, even like the robotic yodels you get out of auto-tune when you misuse it. So artistically misusing your instruments and plugins for an intention is really useful. So now I get to this bit. I want to a lot of the audio drama I've worked on tend to be rooted in simulating a real space. So the actors are recorded in separate booths, and over lockdown they might have been in separate buildings or even separate countries, but we try and make it sound afterwards that they were in a room talking to each other. So you place the voices slightly left and slightly right in a stereo field. You put a little reverb on it, and you put some background noise to give it kind of atmosphere, and it more or less sounds like they're in the same space. Some people might take the same approach when mixing a rock band. So you may have seen this sort of diagram before. I'll stop this just now. So you've got all the different instruments laid out in terms of how you're panning them, and people have lots of suggestions about what has to go where and what needs to go in different places. But if you actually think about that realistically, that no one ever would be in a physical room where that could happen. You can't have your head next to every single drum at once. There's no way of having the singer in front of you and all the echo from that singer be behind them. And it's a really weird way of a lot of people would mix a drum kit from the point of view of the drummer and then place it in a room as if you're in front of the drummer. So if you're going to acknowledge that we're creating a false space in the first place, then maybe it doesn't even need to be a room. This is what the equivalent would kind of look like for some of the drama stuff I'm doing, where you've got main dialogue and Foley close up, mid-distance stuff like crowd, noise or traffic, and then reverb or walla, which is like the sort of sound you get when there is lots and lots of people talking and you can't really pick anything out in the distance. One of the things that will happen with audio drama though is that you'll often have something moving from one of these levels to another then back again. So you might have someone come up to a table where people are talking, give them food or something, or deliver some information, then move away again. So you have them bounce through the levels. And that doesn't happen so much in music, where things tend to stay where they are and not move around too much. And it might be interesting to think about how you could mess with the perspective of things by having people move. Like people do spin individual lines of songs out and have the delay tail off forever. That's interesting. And I like the idea of abandoning realistic spaces completely. So if you can pan synth arpeggios around so that they move around your head in time with the music and the song, why not do the same with backing vocals or individual drums? You could have a crash cymbal that leaves a shower of granular pieces on either side of the stereo field. You could even change the space entirely for different parts of the song. If you're mixing, you're in a sense the set builder and the lighting designer, but the space that you're creating doesn't need to have 4 walls and a ceiling. So I've got another example, which means I have to quit out of this again. I was trying to sound design this scene where a person has taken a jump from a low orbit spaceship and is going to land on a planet. And how you depict that in sound only is a little bit tricky. I decided from a perspective point of view that we would be inside the helmet with her and hear everything from that point of view. It also meant that I could cheat a little bit because I could just distort everything. And hopefully I can get out of Keynote to find the actual example. So it wasn't loaded up. I think it's this one. I should give things better names. So this is her coming down, and what will happen is, well, I haven't got the screenshot for this scene, unfortunately, but we've got the voices coming from inside her head, effectively, and then when she hits the upper atmosphere, we've got a massive distorted noise, which is basically I've stuck a microphone out of the window of a moving car.
Whoa! This is amazing! I think I can see the attraction of extreme sports.
Countdown to atmospheric penetration, 30 seconds.
It's getting a bit warm in here. Can you compensate? Can't move my arms to the climate control.
There's no time.
Really? God, it's hot. I'd better not be about to melt.
15 seconds.
15 seconds? That's not enough to come up with some witty last words.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2,
Oh, God.
1.
Here we go.
Professor Summerfield. Opening parachute. Are you all right? Are you still alive?
Yes? Yes, I think that's what I am.
So, yeah. I should mention that also has music on it. I was doing music for them as well. On a lot of them, I found music really difficult to pitch for these things because you have to be sitting underneath the dialogue, but you have to not be invading that area, and also you get really used to hearing it without music on. So I was actually quite happy to give it to someone else to do music and then finish the mix afterwards. It's back. So next thing I want to talk about is convolution processing. Now, I'm sure that you've probably used convolution reverbs and you probably know what they are, but just in case you're not entirely sure, if you imagine a burst of noise, a short burst of noise, maybe literally just like a t sound, or a balloon bursting is often used. If you were to play that through a space or some processing chains and then record it and analyze the difference between the small burst of noise and the thing that you get back, you can turn that into an equation. Now, I'm vastly oversimplifying here, and hopefully it makes sense. One of the upshots of this is that you can basically sample the acoustics of a space and apply them to a new sound. It's really effective if you want to create small spaces particularly. For longer spaces, it takes more processor power, and you might be good to bring in like an algorithmic reverb as well. Also, it's only linear, so it can't deal with things that have modulation or comb filtering. And it does sound a bit static in comparison to like some of the richer like Eventide or Quantec reverbs that you might be used to hearing. Obviously, being able to sample spaces is great in itself, but if you need an unusual kind of space, it can be interesting to mess with the impulse response. So for instance, you might record at a very high sample rate and slow it down, or even down to quarter speed, and now your room sounds twice as big or 4 times as big. I started thinking like this after hearing that the George Lucas film THX number, I can't remember, they didn't have digital reverbs then, and what they did to get the massive echoes in some scenes in that film was to have the audio played back at high speed in a big space, recorded, and then at normal speed the space sounded twice or 4 times as big. In my case, I had the problem of they wanted the sound of the inside of a metal torture chamber for an adaptation of Phantom of the Opera. They were being really close to the book. If you don't know the story, the book is quite divergent from the musical. It's not a preset that you find on most reverb units. And I found that I could take the impulse response from the inside of a washing machine and then make it sound like a washing machine that you could have someone reasonably stand up in. Where it can get really interesting is if you feed in files which aren't proper impulse responses. I found this because I dropped a file in the wrong place once, basically, and got this amazing textural thing happening when a synth pad started processing all my drum tracks. And then I found that other people have been looking into this as well. If you use something textural like metal being hit or glass breaking or mechanical clanks, what you get out can be really interesting. And I've got a really basic Apple loop here in Logic, and I've got a couple of impulse responses loaded into Space Designer. So this all comes with Logic. I'm not doing anything clever with any fancy plugins that you'd have to buy separately. You've also got a thing that can do convolution in Ableton. There's stuff that does it in Reason. I think most of the major DAWs have it now. So very basic Apple loop by itself. I just have to make sure I've unmuted everything. Going through some clinking branches. They can be a little bit uninspiring by themselves, but you can use them as layers, and you can add like that thing of what I was saying about trying to make a snare drum sound angry, or make a guitar sound more emotive. You can actually mix in the sound of something that is angry. So maybe if you wanted the snare to sound angry, you could take a lion roar and run that through the impulse response and have a sort of roar happening as part of the sound of the snare, and then lower that in the mix so it's subtle, and you're basically psychologically manipulating your audience. Some of the things I found with this, because I was doing some experiments with it recently for this basically, and I was having a lot of fun and realizing that I should be doing more of this, is that if you mess with the size, it will mess with the pitch. So if I was to, I'm going to play this again and mess with some of the parameters. And one of the things you can do is when you've got something rhythmic like that, is adapt it so that the stuff works in terms of tempo, which can be really interesting and fun. I highly recommend playing around with it. Other stuff that I've got in here is, as well as the wood, I'm just going to turn the original sound all the way down. I've got glasses, and then I'll show you a laser gun. So you can get some really cool stuff happening if you. I'd love to spend more time spending with textures and things, but it's well worth having a look into if you haven't done it before. And yeah, you can mess with the sizes and the lengths to make it fit. So that maybe you don't want something that tails off as long as that. You can shorten the length of it. You could reverse it. I've found that that does something really weird with the laser gun. I'm just going to show you that really quickly. It's just a way of getting loads of extra noises for almost no work on your. You're making the decision about what gets processed by what, and like given a huge library of sound, people probably wouldn't think of doing the same thing that you're doing. So you can get some really interesting starting points for things that way. Diego Starco, who's a sound designer who works, he's doing his own thing, but I think he does a lot of work for Spectrasonics, has done some really interesting impulse responses specifically for rhythmic content, and it's worth checking those out if you have the chance. And close this, go back to my presentation. So yeah, you've probably already used it. You can try sampling from real spaces, and I'd like check out little glasses in your house or any spaces that you might find interesting. You can do guitar amps, but it doesn't get that thing of like when you play harder, it doesn't get more distorted because it's linear. But you can mess with the impulse response files, and that's quite fun too. I haven't done this for a while, but I used to try something like putting a modulation effect in them, so each one would kind of bend in the same way with a kind of phase happening. And it's really good as a layer. I wouldn't use it as necessarily the main sound, but you can add like subtle things to stuff that already exists. So what to do with this information? If you haven't tried sampling everything that you can hit scrape or resonate in your house, it's worth trying. Try recording as you play about with plugins or hardware or both. I'm not sure why my reactor thing has managed to stay on the screen. Let's see if I can do anything about that. Nope, thanks Apple. It's just going to stay there. Just going to stay there. think abstractly about the space that you're presenting your sound in, because messing with the space or the parameters where the things performed in the first place can have a huge effect on what you get out at the end of it. And that's kind of all I've got for just now. So thank you very much for coming and listening. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, amazing. So basically, I'm going to open questions to the room first, if you have them. Now is the moment, the special window. That was amazing. That's given me tons of ideas. But anyway, I will also talk to the stream and see if anyone has any questions over there. Don't be shy.
Anyone?
Yep.
Yep.
Thea, what's the most interesting thing you think you've done with a piece of free software or a free plugin or something that you just been playing around with and was like, actually, that's amazing?
I'm trying to remember the name of it now. There was a suite of spectral plugins, and I don't know if they even still work anymore. I would need to Google to check what they actually were, but they were really cool, and they did stuff that reminded me of like software that you'd pay a lot more money for, where it kind of did spectral blurring and would create drones out of things. It was very clever. Also very processor intensive and would often make things crash. Which is another good thing about recording as you go along, because then if it crashes, you've got it, even if you haven't saved it.
Okay, I have a question. Which technique do you find yourself using the most in sound design?
I think things like pitch shift and time stretch probably the most, because it's how I will make something fit in a particular space. In that clip from Bernice Summerfield we heard, I'm really anal, because I don't know if some of the listeners might be, about when a computer says something like this will happen in 17 seconds, I make sure it is 17 seconds before that thing happens, even if it means like a couple of extra beats of breath or something before we get there, or speeding something up so that it can hit that thing on time. So yeah, probably things like time stretching.
Everyone's still ticking over.
I'm pretty ignorant about audio, but I was wondering, when you were saying about moving things around in a free space, do you think you could sort of do it to the intensity that you could sort of make someone fall over, or something like that?
Well, as in like make someone listening to it fall over?
Disorientate them.
Yeah, you probably could. I mean, the thing is, when you've got something happening in your ears and your vision doesn't match up, your brain gets really confused and you probably feel a bit sick. It would have to be really accurate for your head. So Neumann made this dummy head shape, which has got sort of human ears on the outside and like a little ear canal with microphones inside. When you listen back on headphones, it sounds like you're standing wherever that dummy head has been placed. But because everyone's internal head space is slightly different, if something I recorded on my ears might not be exactly the same for you. So it would have to be very, very like tailored for a person. You'd have to be really hating someone to make them want to experience that. Or I guess you'd have to have them like so they're blindfolded. I guess you could do that. I think there's probably a worry with VR when you're messing with people's input, basically. You want to make sure that you're not going to make people sick or fall over or throw things at their television.
Okay, I have a question. What technique have you discovered recently that you'd still like to try?
Playing with convolution again in the last few days, putting this together, made me want to go back to that a lot more. But also, I really liked granular synthesis early on. So one of the things that we often have a problem with is when they'll record the actors doing crowd scenes, they might not record as much as we would like. Because it feels weird when you're going for more than about a minute just making rhubarby noises and having to make up things to say. I understand that. And I would use a granular synth that I'd sort of stitched together in Reactor really quickly when I was a student to take those things and like take tiny little bits from all across the WAV file and make it sound like a coherent crowd, basically. I'd love to spend time finessing that and making it so that it worked better at that. And there's probably a plugin you can buy that does that now, but I'd love to like try building it myself and just experiment with it.
What kind of time would that take?
I don't know. I think it depends how much I apply myself to like stuff in Reactor. Because when I was a student, I knew Reactor reasonably well, and I used to build all kinds of things in it for doing little stupid jobs where I just needed like one-off things. So like I heard about the Radiophonic Workshop having a thing called a wobulator, which is basically an oscillator with an LFO attached so that the pitch would wobble up and down. And I was like, I can definitely do that in Reactor. So I made a thing that had 4 of them, and I used them to generate like background sounds for sci-fi locations. But I haven't used Reactor like that in a few years, and it's changed a lot, and I need to just like get back on top of how everything works. I'd also really like to experiment with audio design middleware for computer games. So I had a scene where 2 people are walking together through a long corridor, and there's stuff on the side of the corridor, people like doing blacksmithing and that kind of thing. Took a long time to do in a DAW because I had to draw in all the automation for the stuff getting louder and quieter, and the reverb coming down and then back up again. And actually, if I had something like Unity or with Wise, I could build a sort of rectangular tunnel, attach objects like repeating loops of stuff happening, and then just take the microphone virtually through that space, and it would do it all for me.
Wow.
So I'm going to do some more tutorials and try and get my head around how to do that sort of thing.
Amazing. Anybody else? Okay. I was going to say, can you tell us a bit about how you got involved with the Doctor Who franchise?
Yeah, to start with, when I'd been doing the stuff at a theatre, and one of the people at the theatre had been writing for the people that make the Doctor Who stuff on audio, and he suggested that I contact these people. They'd mentally put me in for a production that was happening much later on, so they'd have time to like get me started and stuff, but actually someone else dropped out of something earlier before that, and I had to do that thing instead, so I was kind of thrown into this slightly strange play. So that was a Bernice Summerfield one, which is like a Doctor Who spin-off. And then I did my first Doctor Who a couple of months later. And I've done a few of those, but I've kind of done lots of like companion Chronicles and Bernice Summerfield, which are kind of tangentially related. They also do Dark Shadows, which is an American kind of gothic soap opera, which I think there was a movie version with Johnny Depp that was a bit, I'm not sure. I haven't seen it. I'm not judging. And then we've done a couple of literary adaptations. So I was involved in doing The Phantom of the Opera and The Invisible Man. The Invisible Man had a couple of really difficult bits in it, because obviously like, I've got the very easy thing that no one can see what's happening anyway. But there's a part in it near the end, and I hope I'm not spoiling it. The book's been out for a very long time, where the villagers managed to track him by putting broken glass on the road, which meant that at some point I had to do the sound of bare feet on broken glass on a road, which worried me a little bit. And I ended up using sand, because that was a bit easier, but it made the right noise. Also, like doing stuff literally often doesn't sound as good as you expect, and a really good example of that is a fire. So often, particularly on like literary adaptation, we'll have like a fire in the background, and it helps you differentiate one space from another. So when you go to a room, you can hear, oh, we're in the room with a fire in it. And actually recording a fire, it sounded weirdly pathetic when you hear it as a thing back. So I ended up doing like getting a rumble sound from this white noise generator with some random filtering thing drawn onto it. And I spent some time breaking some sticks and just played that in randomly. And then I think there was a kind of, I did mix some real fire in for like just the roary parts, and I ended up distorting it to make it sound more fiery. But it ended up being this mixture of things because the real thing didn't work. Same with waterfalls. If you just record a waterfall, it sounds like white noise.
Yeah. Actually, you're right about that. Okay, cool. In that case, I think we might leave it there. So I will just hop in front again to do a quick roundup. Thank you so much. That was so fascinating. And thank you all for coming today, and thank you to people on the stream. Hello, for watching and joining us this evening. If you'd like to find out more about Thea Cochrane's work, where would you find that?
I'm on Twitter.
Okay.
I haven't really got there's a website I've been meaning to put together, but it's not quite there. So yeah, Twitter's probably the best way. I'm on Instagram as well as Thea_COCHR.
Cool, amazing. So go and find out more about Thea and about what Thea is up to, because your projects are very fascinating and diverse, as your interests are. So thanks to all. Our next session will be on the 26th of April with Jess Bartlett doing data sonification at UAL Creative Computing Institute. I think that's correct. I have to all the acronyms. Do join us for that. I think we're almost at capacity for that particular event. So if you can't get a ticket, then join us online, because we will have an amazing time. But for now, thanks everyone for supporting We Move, and we'll see you next time.